Welcome back. Let's talk about the year 2021. We're going to talk about in terms of mid-Missouri, the United States of America, and even some data from around the world as well. The first thing we're going to look at are where we ended up on two top 10 lists. 2021 in mid-Missouri was the 8th warmest and the 6th wettest on record. And we have about 133, 132 years worth of records from 1889, 1890 here in central Missouri. So it's been a while, and you can see making those two top 10 is actually very interesting, because usually when you have a top 10 wettest, it wouldn't be very warm because moisture takes up a lot of heat energy. That's why a lot of our summers recently have been actually relatively seasonal or even below average a little bit in some of those months. Like June and July, we've actually seen below average for those months recently, the past handful of years, because of how wet it's been, how many floods we've had. It has been a lot of them. And so what's interesting is that even though it was so wet, it was still very warm. It makes more sense actually that if we are very warm, it would be dry, which is why too it makes sense that the last time that we were really in a relatively really dry year, a drought, was 2012, which ranks as number one as the hottest. It would also make more sense that a wetter year would actually end up being then a cooler year, right? One of our top 10 coolest. Well, let's take a look at those, and you can see that in fact, of course, you remember 1993, the flood in 1993, the wettest year on record here in central Missouri, and 1985, too, number 3, are also in the top 10 for top 10 coolest years. So the data does even show that too, and this combination makes much more sense. So why, if it was so wet, was it so warm this year too? Let's take a look at every single month of 2021 in central Missouri and the data, and you can see there was only one below average month in 2021, and it was the 9th coldest February on record. Otherwise, we had the 11th warmest March on record. We had a very warm September. It was the 8th warmest September on record. It was, of course, as we remember recently too, the 2nd warmest December on record and the 1st warmest that any of us remember, because number 1 is 1889, the first year of record keeping here in central Missouri. So very warm year, and really the reason that it ended up still being in the top 10 was because of just how consistently we really were above average, only being below average one month, and also just looking at the extreme of things, right? That 1 month being the 9th coldest on record, and that was the only time that we were below average here for the year. Well, let's take a look at the moisture now, and you can see that it was a wet March. Remember that it was a 11th warmest March on record. It was also the 9th wettest March on record. Also, when you look at June, it was the 2nd wettest June on record. We had a lot of flooding going on in June, some record-breaking flooding actually in and around Columbia and other parts of Missouri. In fact, that event in late June ended up being worth $10 million in damage from an assessment done on Missouri from damages and emergency uses there. So a very, very significant flood event there in June. And July ended up being also the 12th wettest July. So a very wet summer for us. Also October, one of the wetter Octobers that we've had on record as well, a top 15 there for us too. So overall, a very consistent with some of these wetter months too, some more of those extremes. When you look back at the past 50, 51 years, you can see that on average, our annual temperature in mid-Missouri specifically has risen by about 3 degrees Fahrenheit. Now let's take a look around the world, and we can see that it was the 6th warmest year on record for the world, and the last 8 of these warmest years on record, and this data going back to 1880, the last 8 years have been the 8 warmest years since 1880. So it's just continuing to be very warm year after year after year after year. For the United States, 2021 was the 4th warmest on record, actually. And when you look overall from the ocean and the land, you can see that much of the world was above average. There luckily were a few places that did go below average. That's nice. I really don't ever want to see this entire map in all red, right? That's definitely not normal. This isn't normal really either, but of course, at least there were a few places that were still below average around the globe. Now let's talk about a few reasons for this, of course. First of all, the human-induced side of it. Well, when we look at the two main components, the two human-emitted heat-trapping gases, carbon dioxide and methane, they did hit all-time highs in 2021. What about the natural cycle, though? Well, when we actually look at, let's talk about the solar cycle. 2021 was near the minimum of the weakest solar cycle that we've had in 100 years. We were also in a La Nina cycle for the bulk of 2021, and both of those things would usually be worldwide coolers. But of course, that's not what happened because the human-induced side of it far outweighs any of that natural cycle, which is why we continue to get warmer and warmer every single year, every single decade, certainly. Also, the other thing that happens is with all these extremes comes a lot of cost. And so when we look at the billion-dollar disasters, and these are all adjusted for inflation over time, you can see that our billion-dollar disasters also continue to be more and more for the most part. And 2021 was no different. We actually saw the third costliest year on record for weather and climate events. $47 billion worth of, or $47 billion weather disasters, $329 billion total for those weather and climate disasters, and that's globally. We also had a record for mega disasters in 2021. For the first time, our human race experienced 4 mega disasters, which are $20 billion events. That's a mega disaster, a $20 billion or more event. The United States saw number 1 this year. It was Hurricane Ida with $75 billion worth of disaster. Also, July flooding in Europe was $46 billion. Summer flooding in China was $30 billion. And February winters, the February winter event, of course, from that polar vortex ejection, which also took a lot of lives, unfortunately, that was a $25 billion disaster. Number 5, by the way, on the list, it's not a mega disaster, but number 5 on the billion-dollar disaster list was $9 billion, and that was from the year-long drought that a lot of the West saw in the United States. And of course, Missouri was actually part of one of the billion-dollar disasters as well, from severe weather in the Midwest over the summer, which ours was, of course, from flash flooding that I told you about, $10 million worth of in Missouri, but also part of an overall billion-dollar disaster in the Midwest from those storms that weren't just in Missouri, but were in multiple states around that same time. Now, of course, this is not great news, right? There's a lot of death and destruction that we're talking about, and we're talking about getting hotter and hotter. I do want to end on more of a better note, though, because I do want to remind you that there is hope. There are solutions, and they exist today. We don't have to keep going in this direction forever and ever and ever and ever. It's going to continue for a little while because it's going to take a while for these solutions to come into place. But if we take action and we actually do put these solutions that do exist today into place, we can make a better world for the future of the human race. If you want to look at more Show Me Climate stories, by the way, just go to komu.com/climate. Or if you go to our streaming service as well, there's an entire line of some video there that you can see too. And of course, you can see links to some of this information as well on my story at komu.com/climate.